Chapter 19. The Fractured Circle. The echoes of Mako's blow hung heavily in the cavern, an unbearable stillness gripping the air. Aros lay stunned on the cold stone floor, golden eyes wide with shock, the protective glow of his mana shield flickering weakly as if in betrayal. "Mako," Aros whispered. The boy's voice, small, hurt, confused, hung in the charged air. Mako stood motionless, the head of his axe still embedded in the shield's dissipating remnants. His chest heaved, his face twisted into a grimace of pain and something darker. The shadow's voice still coiled through his mind, whispering in soft tones. "You saved them. You protected your family. The heart endures because of you." "No," Mako rasped, his hand loosened on the axe. "That's not what I—" What the hell did you just do?" Dolo's voice cracked through the tension. Dolo sprinted across the cavern and slammed into Mako, shoulder first. The impact knocked Mako backward, sending him sprawling across the stone floor. Dolo stood over him, spear pointed at his chest. "You attacked Aros," Dolo said, voice low and dangerous. His chest heaved with fury. "You nearly killed him." Mako blinked, dazed. The voice still whispered, faint but insistent. "I didn't mean to," Mako mumbled. "It was the shadow. I was trying to stop the labyrinth from collapsing." "The labyrinth isn't collapsing," Waya snapped as she knelt beside Aros. The boy's face was pale, his breathing shallow. "You didn't save us, Mako. You endangered everything." The crystal groaned ominously. The veins along its surface darkened, spreading like ink through ice. "We don't have time for this," Irindra said, voice sharp with urgency. "The heart is unraveling." Pip knelt beside Aros. "Is he gonna be okay?" Waya's jaw clenched. He's still connected to the mana, but the backlash was severe. "We need to get him away from here. Now." "Mako!" Waya's voice trembled, raw with disbelief and confusion. Her arms tightened instinctively around Aros, pulling the weakened boy closer, eyes flashing with sudden anger. "What have you done?" Dolo spun sharply, spear instantly aimed toward Mako, eyes narrowed and filled with restrained fury. His breath came heavy, disbelief etched deeply in the lines of his face. "Explain yourself. Now!" Mako stumbled backward, his axe falling from numb fingers, clattering loudly against stone. His eyes were wide, horror-stricken, as he stared at Aros, at what his own hand had wrought. I didn't have a choice," he choked out, the words thick with agony. "The earth spoke. I had to break the corruption." Kaelin's eyes blazed, incredulous. "Corruption? You struck Aros, our friend, our anchor. What corruption could possibly justify this?" Fennex stepped defensively in front of Pip, blades raised, his voice a low growl. "Are you one of them now, Mako? Have you betrayed us for Shadow?" Pip stood frozen, her usual playfulness utterly gone, replaced with heart-wrenching shock. Her hands trembled as she watched Aros struggling to breathe, eyes swimming with tears she refused to shed. Irindra placed a steadying hand on Pip's shoulder, her own expression rigid yet uncertain. She cast a wary glance toward Mako, voice cautious but firm. "Whatever you heard, Mako, whatever the earth whispered, it was shadowed, corrupted. Can't you see that?" Mako shook his head desperately, stumbling backward another step. He felt the mana beneath his feet, trembling as clearly as he felt the mistrustful gaze of the circle bearing down upon him. He wanted to speak, to explain himself, to tell them he had only followed what the mana had commanded, but words failed him. He met Aros's weakened gaze, searching desperately for understanding. The boy said nothing, his eyes heavy-lidded with pain, yet free of accusation. But even Aros's gentle silence cut through him sharply, deeper than any blade. Taran moved slowly forward, his heavy footsteps echoing in the strained silence, his gaze stern yet measured. "You've walked a dangerous line, lad," he murmured carefully. "We need answers, and we need them fast. What exactly did you hear from the earth?" Before Mako could respond, the cavern shuddered violently around them, dark mana veins flaring with sudden malevolent life. The earth itself roared beneath their feet, drowning out their accusations, their confusion, their pain. The heart of mana pulsated slowly as cracks appeared on its side, tendrils of shadow mana trying to force their way in. Slowly, painfully, Waya lifted Aros upright, cradling him protectively. His golden eyes fluttered open, glazed but alert, flickering with a dim awareness. The weakened boy took a shaky breath, his voice soft, trembling with effort. "The serpent is near." Mako, standing apart from the others, flinched at the mention, heart quickening as he felt the oppressive whispers of shadow mana around him. The earth beneath him still resonated, its voice hauntingly familiar, yet tainted by something darker. It whispered again clearly, insistently. "The heart weakens, the circle fractures, the village burns." His fists clenched in frustration and confusion. The voice had guided him before, had demanded action, but now doubt clawed at him relentlessly. He had struck out at Aros to cleanse corruption hidden in the mana. He'd felt the truth of it in his bones. Yet seeing the boy weakened now, his trust wavered. Had he made a terrible mistake after all? Dolo's voice broke through Mako's thoughts, firm and steady despite the tremor in his hands. "This cavern, these roots, they're all connected. We're walking the very foundations of our world." Irindra stepped forward cautiously, her fingers brushing softly over roots etched with faintly glowing crimson sigils. Her eyes narrowed, recognizing the symbols from the stories of her people. "This corruption isn't just spreading randomly. It's targeted, purposeful." Fenix shifted uneasily beside Pip, his voice low, eyes wary. "And it's getting stronger." Waya gently brushed hair from Aros's face, searching his eyes carefully. "Can you feel it, Aros?" "What's down here?" Aros nodded slowly, lips trembling slightly. "Typhon. He's close now. And something else, something that was hidden in the mana itself." Mako turned sharply away from them, guilt burning in his chest. He had done what the earth had told him clearly to do, but it had left him shattered, questioning himself and the whispers that guided him. Kaelin watched Mako quietly, concern and mistrust battling in her gaze. The corruption here, it speaks louder than ever. We're standing in the very heart of the imbalance. Fenix glanced around uneasily, blades tight in his grip. "So, what's the plan? Do we fight or run?" Dolo straightened his shoulders, determination hardening his voice. "We stop this, here and now." The cavern shuddered softly, roots shifting subtly like living, breathing things. Above them, unseen in the oppressive gloom, stone groaned ominously, strained and weakening. Aros's voice came again, quiet but urgent. "It knows we're here." Before anyone could respond, the mana veins along the cavern walls pulsed violently, a wave of corrupted power sweeping outward in a rush of dark energy. The veins pulsed in rhythm with the throb of something larger, something vast and ancient. The shadow whisper returned, faint but persistent. "The heart weakens, the circle fractures, the village burns." The cavern extended into darkness. Roots coiled along the walls like petrified serpents, their surfaces etched with glowing crimson sigils. Waya helped Aros sit up. The boy's face was pale, his eyes heavy-lidded. "The serpent is near," he whispered. "It knows we're here." "Why does it want the heart so badly?" Dolo asked. Aros shuddered. Because the heart anchors the mana streams. If it breaks, Typhon can reach the surface. The serpent, Waya murmured. The world dweller. The world tree, Dolo realized. The roots they'd walked for days were part of a cosmic balance. The shadow wasn't just spreading through the ground, it was poisoning the very foundation of their reality. Then we stop it, Dolo said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. We get to the heart and cut the shadow out. Mako didn't respond. He stood at the cavern's edge, staring into the next passage where the crimson veins thickened. His expression was blank, but his shoulders were rigid. Mako! Dolo stepped toward him. The ground beneath Mako's feet vibrated subtly. He tilted his head as if listening to a distant voice. They're here, Mako whispered. Who's here? Dolo demanded. Mako's eyes flicked toward him. The Guardians! Crimson sigils pulsated as shadows along the walls detached themselves from them. The shadow figures emerged, both a mixture of dwarven and shadow, from the walls, their forms twisting into humanoid shapes. They were faceless, with hollow eyes and bodies formed from solidified darkness. They moved with fluid, predatory grace. 6 of them. Each wielded a weapon of shadow mana, axes, spears, and whips that crackled with dark energy. The ground trembled beneath Dolo's feet. The wind stirred faintly at his call, but it was sluggish. The air itself seemed infected. Form a circle, Waya ordered. The group closed ranks around Aros. Dolo braced his spear. Irindra knocked an arrow, mana shimmering along the shaft. Pip crouched low, daggers gleaming. The Guardians lunged. Dolo lashed out with a slicing arc of wind. The spear's edge hummed as the mana carved through the nearest shadow. The figure disintegrated, only to reform seconds later. Mako swung his axe at another Guardian. The stone beneath his feet cracked as he channeled his mana through the weapon. The shadow creature staggered under the blow, but didn't collapse. They're feeding on the shadow veins, Waya shouted. We have to break the runes. The crimson sigils along the walls pulsed brighter with each passing second. On it! Pip darted toward the nearest rune. She leapt onto the wall, dug her daggers into the glowing etching, and slashed. Mana sparked as the rune shattered. The nearest Guardian convulsed and collapsed into dust. That's it, Fennec said, sprinting toward another rune. The remaining Guardians moved to block them. Aros pushed himself to his knees, hands trembling. His golden eyes flared as he reached for the mana lines beneath the surface. I can help, he whispered. Mana surged from the ground and wrapped around Dolo's spear. The wind responded eagerly this time, sharp and cold. He lunged and drove the spear into the chest of the nearest Guardian. The creature shattered. The others followed suit. Fennex and Pip struck the runes while Mako unleashed his full strength, sending shock waves through the walls. The Shadow Guardians crumbled one by one. The last rune shattered with a crackling hiss. The Guardians vanished. The ground trembled more violently than before. The core is unguarded now, Waya said. This was its final defense. Dolo wiped sweat from his brow. Then let's move. The passage beyond the chamber was narrow and lined with roots as thick as tree trunks. The air grew warmer with each step. The mana streams pulsing beneath the surface flickered like veins under strained skin. The group moved cautiously. The tension was palpable. Mako trailed behind the others, his steps heavy. The shadow's whisper had grown louder after the fight. Each step deepened its presence. Stonebreaker, you are the anchor, the key. Break the heart and free the earth. Mako rubbed his temple. The voice coiled tighter around his thoughts. You okay? Fennex asked, falling into step beside him. Mako forced a nod. Yeah, just... The mana's loud. Tell it to shut up, Pip called from ahead, trying to inject some levity. Mako nodded but said nothing. The tunnel ended at an archway entwined with roots. Beyond it, a vast cavern opened before them. At its center lay the heart of mana. The heart was not what they expected. A massive crystalline structure hovered above a pit of swirling energy. It pulsed with deep blue-green light, casting ghostly reflections across the walls. Its roots stretched into the ground like arteries connecting to the planet's core, but shadow veins had already pierced its surface. Cracks marred the crystal, and crimson tendrils pulsed across its surface like infected scars. Aros gasped. The seal is breaking. The energy below the crystal churned in chaotic spirals. Waya stepped closer, eyes narrowing. If Varrokan breaches the heart, mana will unspool across the land. The shadow will consume everything. What do we do? Dolo asked. Oros pointed toward the roots. We need to sever the corrupted veins. If we break the shadow's grip, the heart can heal itself. Simple, Pip said. Cut the evil veins. Stop the shadow apocalypse. Got it. The group moved to different roots, channeling their mana to sever the corrupted sections. The cavern trembled. The crimson veins in the walls brightened. The serpent stirred. The shadows coiled along the cavern walls, merging into a single mass that pooled beside the heart of mana. The dark mist thickened, swirling like a slow cyclone. The temperature plummeted. From the mist, a figure emerged, standing behind Mako. Waya pointed to the space behind Mako, a look of surprise on her face. Mako turned to face the figure. Everyone steadied themselves. Varrokan stepped forward slowly, his robes shifting like liquid shadow, crimson eyes gleaming with dark triumph. His gaze swept slowly over the battle-readied stance of the circle of guardians of Aros, a predatory smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You did well, Stonebreaker," he said softly, mockery heavy in his tone. "The heart weakens, the seal fractures, and now your circle crumbles." Mako's breath caught painfully in his chest. His hands shook violently as he struggled upright, eyes wide with confusion and anger. "No," he rasped desperately. "I didn't—" Varrokan chuckled softly, eyes glinting with amusement. "Didn't you? You knew what you had to do. Deep down, you've always known." Mako's head spun, his mind flashing back to the whispers he'd heard clearly from the earth, shadows woven through the mana itself, urging him unmistakably to strike out at Aros. Not to harm, but to purge something dark, something hidden beneath the surface. It had felt right, pure, undeniable, like a truth carved into his very bones. Yet seeing Aros weakened now, he doubted himself fiercely. "You're lying," Mako snarled, voice trembling. "I never listened to you. I listened only to the earth." Varrokan tilted his head, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "I never claimed otherwise, Stonebreaker. You followed the earth's shadowed whispers. The darkness you fear has always been a part of it. The earth seeks balance, release. You were simply its chosen hand." "No," Mako growled, but the protest died weakly in his throat, strangled by uncertainty. Varrokan's smile widened. "You feel it even now, don't you? Beneath your feet, the stone weeps. It cries out for freedom from pain, from imbalance. It begs for release." Mako's fingers tightened on his axe, the voice in his mind suddenly echoing clearly, the same voice from before, threaded with shadowed earth mana, resonating through him. "The stone must break. The shadow must be cleansed. Strike, Stonebreaker. Strike true." "Be silent," Mako hissed fiercely, shutting his eyes tightly. He felt dizzy, sickened by doubt. He had followed his gut, trusted in the earth's whispers completely. How could the mana itself betray him? How could it demand he harm a friend? Varoken turned slowly toward Aros, whose body was weak and trembling in Waya's protective embrace. Look at your young avatar, fragile, incomplete. The heart's power slips from his grasp. Your strike was necessary, inevitable. Mako stood frozen, unable to move. Had he been tricked by the earth itself? Had shadows corrupted even Mana's truth? His eyes met Oros's for an instant, searching desperately for answers, for reassurance, for forgiveness. But Aros was too weakened to speak, only watching him quietly. Golden eyes dimmed with pain, but without accusation. The Shadow Master turned his attention to the others. His gaze lingered on Aros. And you, little avatar, so young, so incomplete. The heart's power was yours to wield, yet you falter. Aros shifted weakly in Waya's arms, trying to sit up. His golden eyes glimmered with renewed determination. "You're wrong," the boy said, voice hoarse but defiant. "The heart isn't yours. The circle won't let you win." "The circle?" Varoken's eyes glinted with amusement. "Look around you." The circle of heroes stood bloodied and battered, their bodies aching from the relentless onslaught of the Shadow Guardians. The cavern's oppressive air clung to them, thick with the stench of corrupted mana. Each breath felt heavier, each movement burdened with exhaustion. Yet they stood. Their wounds burned, their muscles trembled, but none of them faltered. Even as the shadows twisted unnaturally around them, even as the presence of Varokan pressed against their very souls, like a hand squeezing the life from their chests, they did not turn away. Varokan stepped forward, his silhouette shifting like liquid darkness. His crimson eyes burned with amusement, lips curling into a cruel smile. "The circle," his voice dripped with mockery. "Look around you." Dolo planted his feet, lowering his stance as his grip tightened around his spear. His breath came slow and measured, but his body coiled with the readiness of a wolf about to strike. His sharp eyes locked onto the Shadowborn master, searching for weakness. He had fought warriors, creatures, horrors beyond understanding, but none carried the same sense of inevitability that Varokan did. Dolo's gut told him that if they failed here, there would be no second chance. Behind him, Waya stood tall, her staff glowing faintly in her grasp. The flickering light of her mana shield cast long, wavering shadows across the cavern floor. Sweat slicked her brow, her breathing labored, but her resolve never wavered. She fought the growing tremor in her limbs, the heavy fatigue of maintaining her protective barrier over Aros. If she let go now, he would be vulnerable, and she would not allow that. Fennex crouched low, his hands clenched around his daggers, but his fingers trembled slightly against the worn hilts. His usually sharp and confident posture wavered as he fought to suppress the quiver of exhaustion. Pip was beside him, eerily still, gripping the handle of her dagger so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her ears twitched, but for once she said nothing. The weight of what they faced settled over her like a suffocating blanket. Arindra stood close to them, her grip firm around the Whisper Stone, as if grounding herself against the fear creeping into her chest. The stone hummed, sending faint ripples of mana through her veins, a steady reminder that they were not alone in this fight. But even that was not enough to dispel the dread gnawing at the edges of her mind. Kalen's staff tapped lightly against the cavern floor, her deep shamanic magic stirring the very earth beneath them. The weight of the mountain pressed against her senses, an ancient force, watching, waiting. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but she swallowed her fear. The black mana panther that had been with her in visions now prowled beside her, eyes glowing like molten gold, its spectral form flickering in and out of reality. It was no longer just a vision. It was real, summoned from the depths of her soul. Tyrion stood like an unmovable wall, his battle axe resting across his shoulder, his iron skin shimmering in the dim light. His breathing was slow and even, his gaze cold and calculating. He had spent a lifetime in the depths of the mountains, but even he had never encountered a presence like Varokan's. His instincts screamed of a fight that would not end in simple victory. It would be blood and sacrifice, and perhaps not all of them would walk away. And then there was Mako. He lingered at the edge of the circle apart from the others, separated by more than just distance. His hands flexed at his sides, one gripping his axe, the other clenched into a fist. His face was unreadable, but his thoughts raged. The earth mana had guided him to strike at Aros, yet doubt lingered, festering inside him like a wound. Had he truly done what was needed, or had he allowed the shadow to seep into his choices, twisting his actions into something darker? He could still hear the whisper of the earth beneath him, but it was tangled now, uncertain. Varokan's gaze settled on him, and for a brief moment Mako saw something in those crimson eyes that unsettled him. A knowing, an understanding. "You hesitate, Stonebreaker." Varokan's voice slithered into his thoughts. "You feel it, don't you? The divide growing wider. The path you walk is not theirs. You were always meant for something more." Mako's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening around his axe. His mind screamed at him to ignore the words, but they echoed too deeply. Varokan extended his arms, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the cavern. "The circle is broken," he declared. His voice reverberated, sending a pulse of shadow mana through the chamber. The air crackled. The oppressive weight grew heavier. Aros groaned softly in Waya's arms, still too weak to rise, but his golden eyes flickered open just long enough to see Varokan's form looming in the darkness. Even as his body failed him, even as mana slipped through his fingers like water, he still had enough strength to whisper, "You're wrong." The heart cracked. A fissure split the crystal's surface with a sound like glass shattering. A pulse of shadow mana erupted outward, knocking everyone off their feet. Varokan vanished into the mist. Dolo groaned and pushed himself to his knees. The cavern trembled as deep rumbles rolled through the stone. The heart's glow flickered wildly. "Is it collapsing?" Pip asked, coughing. "No," Waya said, eyes on the heart. "It's bleeding mana." Aros struggled to his feet. His legs wobbled beneath him. "We need to get out of here," he said. "If the heart fully fractures, the backlash will kill us all." Dolo's gaze snapped to Mako. The Earthwielder stood apart from the group, axe lowered, eyes distant. Dolo hesitated, then made a decision. "Mako, we need you." Mako's head jerked toward him. The conflict in his eyes was obvious. The shadow still whispered. "You can fight it," Dolo said. "You're still part of this circle. We need your strength to get out." Mako's grip on his axe tightened. The voice roared in protest, but he took a step toward the group. The ground heaved beneath them. The crystal's surface shattered further, and arcs of wild mana lashed out like snapping whips. One bolt struck the cavern wall, reducing stone to ash. "This way!" Fennec shouted, pointing toward a tunnel that had cracked open during the tremor. The group sprinted toward the opening. Aros faltered, legs giving way. Dolo scooped him up and carried him without breaking stride. Behind them, shadow tendrils slithered along the ground. The serpent's influence reached through the walls, hunting them. The tunnel twisted upward, angling toward the surface. The walls vibrated with the force of the mana backlash. Loose stones rained down from the ceiling. Pip ran beside Dolo, panting heavily. "So, just to clarify, the giant evil snake thing is chasing us?" "Yes," Dolo said through gritted teeth. "Okay, just checking." A roar shook the passage. The shadows surged behind them, forming a colossal serpent's head that filled the width of the tunnel. Its eyes burned crimson. Aros stirred in Dolo's arms. "Typhon," the boy whispered. "It's him." The serpent hissed and the tunnel ahead of them twisted. The walls bent inward like ribs closing around a trapped animal. "The maze is warping," Arindra shouted. "It's trying to keep us here." Waya slowed, staff raised. "I can disrupt the pattern. Get to the surface." "No!" Dolo turned toward her. "We stick together." The ground cracked beneath their feet. The tunnel began to collapse. "Dolo," Waya said gently. "Lead them. I'll hold the passage." Dolo froze. His breath caught in his throat. He met Waya's gaze. The understanding there broke his heart. "Go." Dolo hesitated only a moment longer, then nodded. "We'll find you." "You will," Waya said, smiling faintly. "Now go." The group surged forward. Waya turned to face the shadow serpent. The staff in her hand vibrated with mana as she planted it into the ground. The serpent lunged. Waya drew upon the life force of the roots around her, channeling everything into a wall of stone and mana. The serpent slammed into the barrier. The impact shattered the staff and sent Waya to her knees. She gasped as shadow tendrils wrapped around her limbs, dragging her toward the heart. In her mind, a familiar voice echoed, "You cannot stop the serpent alone." Waya closed her eyes. "I'm not alone." She reached through the mana streams and connected with the circle. Dolo gasped as Waya's voice brushed his mind. "Protect him. Protect Aros. The shadow isn't done." He tried to respond, but the link snapped as the passage collapsed behind them. Waya was gone. The group emerged from the labyrinth into the pale gray light of dawn. The fresh air hit them like a cold wave. Dolo set Aros down gently and turned toward the cave entrance. The ground sealed itself with a groaning finality. "Waya," Pip whispered. "She bought us time," Dolo said hoarsely. Mako fell to his knees, dropping his axe. He stared at his hands as though seeing them for the first time. "I heard her," he muttered. "I heard her voice. She was afraid." Dolo gripped his spear so tightly his knuckles turned white. Rage boiled through his veins. He turned toward Mako. "You did this," Dolo said. Mako didn't deny it. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the corrupted mana pulsed once more. Far beneath them, the serpent stirred. The heart of mana had cracked, and the circle was broken.